painted love. The rain fell softly against the windows of the old art supply store on Maple Street, creating tiny rivers that raced down the glass like nature's own watercolor painting. Ethan Marshall pushed through the heavy wooden door with his shoulder. His 1-year-old son Leo balanced on his hip, both of them slightly damp from the unexpected afternoon shower. The bell above the door chimed with a gentle, almost musical sound that seemed to linger in the air longer than it should have. Leo's eyes widened at the sound, his small hands reaching toward the ceiling as if he could catch the notes floating invisibly above them. The store smelled of linseed oil and fresh paper, mixed with something else Ethan couldn't quite place, something warm and comforting, like cinnamon or old books or maybe both. Ethan hadn't planned to come here today. He'd been walking aimlessly through the neighborhood, trying to clear his mind after another sleepless night, when the rain started. The art supply store had appeared almost magically, tucked between a coffee shop he'd never noticed and a vintage clothing boutique that seemed perpetually closed. The painted sign above the door read, "Morgan's Colors," in faded gold lettering that caught the light in strange ways, making it seem to shimmer even in the gray afternoon. Leo babbled something incomprehensible but enthusiastic, pointing at the colorful display of paintbrushes arranged in the window like a rainbow frozen in time. That's when Ethan noticed how quiet the store was. Not empty quiet, but the kind of quiet that felt full of possibilities, like a blank canvas waiting for its first stroke of paint. The interior of the store was unlike any art supply shop Ethan had ever seen. Instead of harsh fluorescent lights, warm amber lamps cast golden pools of light throughout the space, creating shadows that danced between the shelves. Easels stood at various angles, some holding half-finished paintings that seemed to watch them as they passed. The paintings were strange, not quite abstract, not quite realistic, but something in between that made Ethan's eyes linger on them longer than he intended. One showed what might have been a forest, but the trees seemed to be breathing, their leaves shifting slightly, even though there was no breeze in the store. Another depicted water, but the waves appeared to be moving, rolling gently across the canvas in an endless loop that made Ethan feel slightly dizzy if he looked too long. Leo squirmed in his arms, wanting to be put down, and Ethan carefully set him on the worn wooden floor. The baby immediately began exploring, his chubby hands reaching for everything within his grasp. Ethan stayed close, ready to prevent any disasters, but something about the store made him feel oddly relaxed, as if nothing here could truly be damaged or broken. The shelves were organized in a way that defied logic. Watercolors next to charcoal, oil paints beside colored pencils, sketchbooks mixed with sculpture tools. Yet, somehow it all made perfect sense, like each item had chosen its own place rather than being arranged by human hands. Leo toddled forward, his attention caught by something Ethan couldn't see from his angle. That's when Ethan noticed the door. It was painted the same color as the wall, almost invisible except for the ornate brass handle that caught the light. Leo was heading straight for it, his determination evident in his wobbling but purposeful gait. Ethan moved to redirect him, but before he could reach his son, Leo's tiny hand wrapped around the handle and pulled. The door swung open silently, revealing darkness beyond. But it wasn't a threatening darkness. It was soft, velvet-like, inviting. Leo giggled and stepped forward, and Ethan, his heart suddenly racing for reasons he couldn't explain, followed. The room beyond the door was larger than it should have been, given the size of the store. Ethan's logical mind tried to map out the dimensions, but they didn't add up. The space seemed to expand and contract with his breathing, as if it were alive. Shelves lined the walls here too, But these held different items, jars of pigments that glowed faintly in the dim light, brushes that looked ancient and new at the same time, canvases that hummed with an energy Ethan could feel in his bones. And there, in the center of the room, was something that made Ethan's breath catch in his throat. It was a bear cub, no larger than a medium-sized dog, sitting perfectly still among scattered art supplies. Its fur seemed to shimmer with colors that shifted as Ethan watched. Brown to gold to copper and back again. Leo made a sound of pure delight and toddled toward the cub without any fear. Ethan's parental instincts kicked in immediately, and he lunged forward to grab his son, but then he noticed something that made him pause. The bear cub wasn't moving. Not because it was sleeping or scared, but because it was wrong somehow. Its eyes, though open, didn't track their movement. Its chest didn't rise and fall with breath. Yet it wasn't a stuffed animal or a statue. It was something else entirely, something that existed in a space between real and unreal that made Ethan's head spin. Beautiful, isn't he? The voice came from behind them, soft and melodious, with an undertone of sadness that made Ethan's chest ache. He turned to see a woman standing in the doorway, her presence so gentle he wondered how he hadn't heard her approach. She was perhaps in her 30s, with dark hair streaked with premature silver that caught the light like moonbeams. Her name tag read Lily Morgan in careful script. Her eyes, a shade of green that reminded Ethan of deep forest pools, were fixed on the bear cub with an expression of such profound love and loss that Ethan felt like he was intruding on something deeply private. Leo had reached the cub now and was patting its head with his small hands, babbling happily. The cub remained still. But something in the air around it seemed to shift, like heat waves rising from hot pavement. Lily stepped into the room, her movements graceful and deliberate, as if she were walking through water. She knelt beside Leo, not stopping him from touching the cub, but watching with an intensity that made Ethan nervous. "Your son has a pure heart," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Children always know when something is special, don't they? They don't question magic the way adults do. Ethan wanted to ask what she meant, wanted to grab Leo and leave this strange place, but something held him there. Maybe it was the way Lily looked at his son with such kindness, or maybe it was the way the room itself seemed to pulse with a warm, comforting energy. Is it real?" he finally managed to ask, the question sounding absurd even as it left his lips. Lily's smile was sad and beautiful at the same time. "What is real, Mr. She paused, waiting for his name. "Marshall, Ethan Marshall," he supplied automatically. "What is real, Mr. Marshall? Is a memory real? Is a dream real? Is love real?" She stood slowly, her hand briefly touching the cub's head where Leo's had been. "This is Oscar. He's as real as anything else in this world, perhaps more so because he was created from pure love." The story she began to tell was unlike anything Ethan had expected. Lily spoke of her younger brother, Oliver, who had loved bears more than anything in the world. He'd collected bear figurines, drawn bears constantly, dreamed of becoming a wildlife photographer specializing in bears. But Oliver had been sick, the kind of sick that steals children away too young, leaving behind only memories and unfinished dreams. In his final weeks, Oliver had asked Lily to paint him a bear. A special bear that would never leave, never grow old, never die. Lily had been an artist all her life, but this request had challenged her in ways she'd never imagined. How do you paint something that needs to be more than paint and canvas? She had worked for days without sleeping, mixing her paints with tears and prayers and something else she couldn't name. She'd painted not just with brushes but with her fingers, pressing her love and grief and hope into every stroke. And when she'd finished, when the last detail was complete, something extraordinary had happened. The bear had looked back at her. Not moved, not exactly, but acknowledged her in a way that transcended physical movement. Oliver had seen it too in those final days, had held conversations with Oscar that Lily could only half hear, had smiled more in that last week than he had in months. After Oliver passed, Lily had tried to convince herself that Oscar was just a painting, just oils and canvas and wishful thinking. But she couldn't bring herself to sell him or display him with her other work. He lived in this back room, in this space between spaces, where the boundary between art and life was thinner than anywhere else in the world. Sometimes, late at night, when the store was closed and the world was quiet, she would sit with Oscar and tell him about her day, and she swore she could feel Oliver's presence, could hear his laughter in the way the air moved around the painted cub. Leo had settled down next to Oscar now, leaning against the cub's still form with the casual comfort children show when they feel completely safe. Ethan watched, mesmerized, as his son's breathing seemed to sync with something invisible, some rhythm in the room that he could almost but not quite perceive. "Why are you telling me this?" Ethan asked, his voice rough with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. Lily's eyes met his, and in them he saw a recognition that made his stomach flip. "Because you understand loss," she said simply. "I can see it in the way you hold your son, like you're afraid he might disappear. And because Leo sees Oscar for what he really is. Not a limitation, not a sadness, but a celebration of love that transcends the physical." Ethan wanted to deny it, wanted to pretend he didn't know what she was talking about, but the words stuck in his throat. His wife, Jessica, had been gone for 6 months now. A car accident, they'd said, quick and painless, as if that made it better somehow. He'd been raising Leo alone, going through the motions, trying to be both mother and father to a child who was too young to understand why Mama never came home. He'd avoided anything that reminded him of her. Her art supplies still sat untouched in their spare room. Her paintings still hung on the walls covered with sheets because he couldn't bear to look at them, but couldn't bear to take them down either. She was an artist, he found himself saying, the words pulled from him by something in Lily's gentle presence. Jessica. She painted. Landscapes mostly, but sometimes she'd paint Leo and me. She used to say that art was the only way to make moments last forever, to catch time and hold it still. His voice broke on the last word, and he was horrified to feel tears on his cheeks. But Lily didn't look away or offer empty platitudes. She simply nodded, as if she'd known this all along. "The spare room," she said, and it wasn't a question. "You haven't been in there since." Ethan nodded, unable to speak. Leo chose that moment to stand up, his little hands pressed against Oscar's painted fur. He looked back at his father with eyes that seemed far too wise for his age and said, clear as day, "Mama." It was one of his few words, and hearing it in this strange, magical room made Ethan's knees weak. He sank down beside his son, gathering Leo into his arms, breathing in his baby scent of powder and milk and innocence. "Sometimes," Lily said softly, "love leaves traces in the world that we can't see but can feel. Children are especially sensitive to these traces. They haven't learned yet that such things are impossible." The rain outside had intensified, drumming against the windows with a rhythm that seemed to match Ethan's heartbeat. The room had grown warmer, or maybe it was just Ethan's perception shifting, adjusting to this space that existed outside normal reality. Oscar remained still. But there was something different about him now, something Ethan couldn't quite identify. The colors in his fur seemed brighter, more vivid, as if Leo's touch had awakened something dormant. "Would you like to know a secret?" Lily asked, and both Ethan and Leo turned to look at her. "Oscar isn't finished. Oliver died before I could complete him. There's one more element missing. Something I've never been able to add because it wasn't mine to give." She moved to a shelf and pulled down a wooden box, worn smooth by years of handling. Inside were tubes of paint, but not ordinary paint. These seemed to pulse with their own light, colors that didn't have names, that existed in the spaces between the colors everyone knew. Oliver believed that art was collaborative, Lily explained, her fingers ghosting over the tubes without touching them. He thought that every piece of art was incomplete until it had been touched by someone else's story, someone else's love. He made me promise that one day, when the right person came along, I would let them help finish Oscar. Ethan looked at the bear cub, at his son, who was now tracing patterns in the air around Oscar's head, at Lily, who waited with infinite patience for something she seemed to have been waiting for since her brother's death. "But I'm not an artist," he protested weakly. "Jessica was the artist. I can barely draw a stick figure." Lily's smile was knowing and kind. "Art isn't about skill, Mr. Marshall. It's about truth. It's about taking what's inside and making it visible. Your son already knows this. Look at him." And Ethan did look, really looked, at Leo. His son was moving his hands through the air around Oscar as if he were painting with invisible brushes, his face serene and focused in a way Ethan had never seen before. The air where his hands passed seemed to shimmer slightly, leaving traces of color that faded as quickly as they appeared. It was impossible, Ethan's logical mind insisted, but his heart, the part of him that Jessica had always said was his best part, recognized the truth of what he was seeing. Leo was painting with something beyond paint, beyond the physical. He was painting with love itself. "The thing about love," Lily continued, her voice taking on a dreamlike quality, "is that it doesn't die when people do. It transforms, becomes something else, finds new ways to express itself. Oliver's love became Oscar. Your Jessica's love, well, that's still finding its form, isn't it? It lives in Leo, in you, in the paintings under sheets in your spare room. But maybe, just maybe, some of it could live here too, helping to complete something that's been waiting." The room had definitely changed now. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like lungs. The jars of pigment on the shelves glowed brighter, casting rainbow shadows that danced across the floor. And Oscar was different. Still unmoving, still caught between real and unreal, but somehow more present, more there. Ethan could feel something building in the air, a pressure that wasn't unpleasant but was definitely significant, like the moment before lightning strikes or the pause before a first kiss. Leo turned to his father, his eyes bright with something that might have been recognition or might have been invitation. He reached out his small hand, and Ethan, moving as if in a dream, took it. The moment their hands touched, Ethan felt it, a jolt of something electric and warm that traveled up his arm and straight to his heart. Images flashed through his mind. Jessica painting in their sunlit apartment, her face concentrated and beautiful. Leo's birth, Jessica's tears of joy mixing with his own. Quiet mornings when the three of them would lie in bed, not talking, just being together. And then darker images, the hospital, the funeral, the empty side of the bed that still smelled like her perfume. But there were other images too, ones that weren't his memories. A young boy with Lily's eyes but lighter hair, laughing as he showed her a drawing of a bear. The same boy, thinner and paler, still smiling as he directed Lily's hand while she painted. And finally, the boy, Oliver, looking directly at Ethan somehow, across time and space and death itself, nodding as if to say, "Yes, you're the one. You understand." Lily had opened the wooden box and was holding out a brush. It was unlike any brush Ethan had ever seen, its handle carved from what looked like crystallized light, its bristles moving gently as if stirred by an unfelt breeze. "This was Oliver's," she said simply. He wanted it to be used by someone who understood that art isn't about creating something from nothing. It's about revealing what was always there, waiting to be seen. Ethan's hand moved without his conscious decision, taking the brush. It was warm in his palm, pulsing with a life of its own. Leo clapped his hands in delight and pointed at Oscar. And suddenly, Ethan could see it, the incompleteness Lily had mentioned. It was like looking at a puzzle with one piece missing. So obvious once you noticed it that you couldn't understand how you'd missed it before. There, just over Oscar's heart, was a space that wasn't empty but wasn't full either. It waited. "What do I paint?" Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. Lily shook her head. "You don't paint anything. You let what needs to be painted paint itself through you. Close your eyes. Think of Jessica. Think of love. Think of what continues even when everything else ends." Ethan closed his eyes, feeling ridiculous and sacred at the same time. He thought of Jessica's laugh, the way she would dance in the kitchen while cooking, how she would trace patterns on his back when she thought he was asleep. He thought of her final painting, the one she'd been working on before the accident, a landscape that she'd said was about permanence and impermanence, whatever that meant. The brush moved in his hand, and he let it. He didn't direct it, didn't control it, just let it do what it needed to do. He could feel Leo's hand on his leg, anchoring him to the present while his mind drifted through the past. Colors that didn't exist in the normal world flowed from the brush, the gold of Jessica's hair in sunlight, the blue of her eyes when she cried at happy endings, the green of the park where they'd gotten married, the soft pink of Leo's newborn skin. These colors merged and separated, creating something that was both image and emotion, both memory and hope. Time became elastic in that back room. Ethan might have been painting for minutes or hours or days. He was dimly aware of Lily humming something, a melody that seemed familiar but that he couldn't quite place. Leo's babbling provided a counterpoint, nonsense words that somehow made perfect sense in this context. And underneath it all was a rhythm, a heartbeat that might have been Oscar's or Oliver's or Jessica's, or maybe all of theirs combined, beating in sync with the universe itself. When Ethan finally opened his eyes, the brush falling from his suddenly exhausted hand, he gasped. Oscar was looking at him, not moving, not breathing in the traditional sense, but definitely looking, definitely seeing. And there, over his heart, was a shape that hadn't been there before. It was abstract and realistic at once. A heart that was also a home, that was also a tree, that was also two hands holding. It pulsed with soft light, and in that light Ethan could see faces. Jessica's, yes, but also Oliver's, and Lily's, and his own, and Leo's. It was a portrait of love itself, of all the love that had been and was and would be. Leo walked over to Oscar and placed his tiny hand on the new mark. The moment he made contact, the room filled with warmth and light, and something that might have been laughter or might have been wind chimes or might have been both. Oscar's eyes blinked, just once, slow and deliberate. His head turned slightly, just enough to look directly at Leo. And then, impossible but undeniable, one paw lifted and gently touched Leo's hand. Lily was crying, silent tears that she didn't bother to wipe away. Oliver always said it would take a child's touch to wake him properly, she whispered, A child who had known loss but hadn't been broken by it, who still believed in magic because no one had told him yet that it didn't exist. She moved closer to Oscar, her hand joining Leo's on his fur. "Hello, old friend," she said softly. "Thank you for waiting." The impossibility of what was happening should have sent Ethan running from the store, but instead he found himself moving closer, adding his hand to the pile. Oscar's fur was warm and soft and definitely real, regardless of how he had come to be. The bear cub made a sound, not quite a growl, not quite a purr, but something uniquely his own. It was the sound of art coming to life, of love taking form, of magic existing simply because enough people believed it should. "What happens now?" Ethan asked, his mind trying to process what he had witnessed, what he had been part of. Lily's smile was different now, lighter somehow, as if a weight she'd carried for years had finally been lifted. Now, Oscar gets to do what Oliver always wanted him to do, bring joy to children who need it. He'll stay here, in this room, and sometimes, when the right child comes in, when someone needs to be reminded that love doesn't end with death, he'll be here. Real, for those who need him to be real, art for those who need him to be art. Leo had climbed onto Oscar's back now, and the bear cub was perfectly still again, but it was a different kind of stillness, the stillness of patience, not of absence. Ethan could see that Oscar was allowing it, choosing to be a gentle friend to his son. Can we come back?" Ethan asked, surprised by how much he wanted the answer to be yes. Lily nodded. "This door is always open to you now. You're part of Oscar's story and he's part of yours. Oliver would have liked that. Stories within stories. All of them true, even when they're impossible." As if responding to some unspoken signal, Leo climbed down from Oscar and toddled back to his father, arms raised to be picked up. Ethan lifted him, feeling how solid and real his son was, how precious this weight in his arms. Oscar had returned to his original position, but the mark over his heart still glowed softly, and his eyes, though unmoving, seemed aware. "Thank you," Ethan said to Lily, though the words felt inadequate. She shook her head. "Thank you. You've given me back a piece of my brother I thought was lost forever. You've shown me that Oliver was right. Love shared isn't diminished, it's multiplied." They left the back room then, returning to the main store where the late afternoon sun was breaking through the clouds, sending rays of golden light through the rain-spotted windows. The store looked different now to Ethan, or maybe he was looking at it differently. Every painting, every brush, every tube of paint seemed to hold potential, seemed to whisper of stories waiting to be told. Leo was drowsy in his arms, the adventure having worn him out, but his little hand clutched something, a small wooden bear that Ethan hadn't seen him pick up. "A gift," Lily said, noticing Ethan's surprise. "From Oscar, or Oliver, or maybe from Jessica, in this place. It's hard to tell where one love ends and another begins." She walked them to the door, the bell chiming its musical note as she opened it. The rain had stopped, and the world outside looked washed clean, sparkling with droplets that caught the light like tiny prisms. "Will you go to the spare room?" Lily asked gently. "Will you look at her paintings?" Ethan thought about it, about the room he'd been avoiding, about the sheets covering Jessica's work, about the pain he'd been trying to outrun. Then he looked at Leo, sleeping now against his shoulder, the wooden bear clutched in his tiny fist. "Yes," he said, and meant it. "I think it's time." Lily smiled and touched Leo's head gently, a blessing or a farewell or both. "Art doesn't end," she said. "It waits, it transforms. It finds new ways to speak, just like love." Walking home through the rain-washed streets, Ethan felt something shift inside him, like a door opening that he hadn't even known was closed. He thought about Oscar, about Oliver, about Lily's patient waiting and Leo's innocent magic. He thought about Jessica and her paintings, about the way she'd always said that art was just another way of loving the world. The wooden bear in Leo's hand seemed to pulse with warmth, or maybe that was just Ethan's imagination. In a world where painted bears could come to life through the touch of a grieving child, anything seemed possible. That night, after Leo was asleep in his crib, the wooden bear placed carefully on the nightstand where he could see it when he woke, Ethan stood outside the spare room. His hand trembled as he turned the doorknob, as he stepped into the space that still smelled faintly of turpentine and Jessica's lavender perfume. One by one, he pulled the sheets off her paintings, really looking at them for the first time since she'd died. They were beautiful, but more than that, they were alive in the way Oscar was alive, with love and intention and something that transcended the physical materials used to create them. The last painting, the one she'd been working on when she died, made him gasp. It was a landscape, yes, but in the foreground was a figure he hadn't noticed before, or maybe it hadn't been there before. It was a bear, standing upright like a person, holding hands with a small child whose face was turned away but whose hair was exactly the color of Leo's. And in the background, so faint he almost missed it, was another figure, a woman made of light and shadow, watching over them both with infinite love. Ethan sat down on the floor, the painting in his lap, and cried for the first time since the funeral. But these weren't just tears of grief. They were tears of recognition, of understanding, of acceptance. Jessica had known something, had painted something that hadn't made sense until now. Art as prophecy, as connection, as a bridge between what was and what is and what might be. He thought of Oscar, waiting in that back room for years until the right child came along. He thought of Lily, keeping faith with her brother's vision even when it must have seemed like madness. He thought of Leo, too young to know that magic wasn't real, and therefore able to make it real through his belief. The next morning, Ethan woke to find Leo standing in his crib, pointing at the wooden bear and babbling excitedly. But the bear had changed. Where it had been plain wood the night before, now there were traces of color in the grain, swirls of gold and blue and green that seemed to move when Ethan wasn't looking directly at them. Leo reached for his father, and when Ethan picked him up, his son said, clear as day, "Oscar." It was a new word, but somehow Ethan wasn't surprised. In a world where love could take physical form, where art could breathe and dream, where children could wake sleeping magic with their touch, anything was possible. They returned to Morgan's Colors that afternoon, and the next, and the next. Each time, the door to the back room opened easily for them, and Oscar would be there, sometimes still, sometimes moving in his subtle, impossible way. Other children came too, Ethan discovered, children who had lost something or someone, children who needed to believe in magic, children whose hearts were pure enough to see what adults had forgotten how to see. Oscar was different for each of them, Ethan realized. For some, he was a comfort. For others, an adventure. For Leo, he was a friend who existed in the space between real and imaginary, teaching him that the boundary between the two was far more fluid than most people believed. Lily began teaching Ethan about art, not the technical skills but the deeper truths. She showed him how colors could carry emotions, how brush strokes could be prayers, how a canvas could be a doorway to other worlds. He wasn't good at it, not in any traditional sense, but he found that when he painted while thinking of Jessica, while Leo played at his feet, something emerged that was more than the sum of its parts. His paintings were clumsy but honest, raw but real. Lily hung them in the store anyway, next to her more polished works, and sometimes people would stop and stare at them. Tears in their eyes, though they couldn't say why. One day, about a month after their first visit, Ethan arrived to find someone else in the back room with Oscar. It was a little girl, maybe 5 years old, with her grandmother. The child was blind, her eyes clouded, but her hands were on Oscar's fur and her face was radiant with joy. "She says he's singing to her," the grandmother whispered to Ethan, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "She says he sounds like her mother used to, before the cancer." Ethan watched as Oscar leaned into the child's touch, and he could swear he heard it too, a humming, melodic and wordless, that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. That was when Ethan truly understood what Lily had been trying to tell him. Oscar wasn't just one thing. He was whatever each person needed him to be, a mirror for their love and loss and hope. He was Oliver's legacy, yes, but he was also more than that. He was proof that love could transcend death, that art could be more than representation, that magic existed in the spaces between what we know and what we believe. Leo toddled over to the blind girl and took her hand, leading her around Oscar, showing her through touch what she couldn't see with her eyes. The two children laughed, and their laughter filled the room with light that had nothing to do with the lamps overhead. As weeks turned to months, Ethan found himself becoming part of the fabric of Morgan's colors. He would help Lily with the store when she needed it, would sit with parents whose children were in the back room with Oscar, would share his own story when it seemed like it might help. He started painting again, really painting, not just grieving on canvas. His subjects were varied, Leo of course, but also Oscar and Lily, and the store itself, and sometimes Jessica, painted from memory, but somehow more vivid than any photograph could capture. Leo grew, as children do, but his connection to Oscar never faded. If anything, it deepened. He would have conversations with the bear cub that Ethan could only partially understand, mixing real words with babble in a language that seemed to make perfect sense to both of them. Sometimes, when Leo was upset or scared, they would visit Oscar, and the bear cub would somehow comfort him without moving. Without speaking in any way Ethan could hear. It was, Lily said, the kind of magic that only worked if you didn't look at it too closely, if you didn't try to explain it or contain it or make it logical. One evening, as autumn was turning to winter and the store was filled with the golden light of early sunset, Ethan found Lily in the back room with Oscar, just sitting quietly. She looked up as he entered, Leo sleeping in his arms, and smiled. "I've been thinking about Oliver a lot lately," she said, "about how he knew, even at 7 years old, that some things are too important to die just because the body does. He used to say that Oscar would outlive us all, that he would be here when the store was gone, when the city was gone, when everything we knew had changed beyond recognition. Because love, real love, the kind that creates rather than destroys, is the only truly eternal thing." Ethan sat down beside her, careful not to wake Leo. "Do you think he was right?" he asked. Lily reached out and touched Oscar's glowing heart mark, the one Ethan had painted without painting, the one that held all their stories. "I know he was," she said simply. "Every time a child sees Oscar, every time someone believes in him even for a moment, Oliver lives again. And Jessica lives in the way you're teaching Leo to see the world, to believe in beauty and magic and love. And someday, when we're gone, there will be others who carry these stories forward, who add their own colors to the painting." As if in response to her words, Oscar's eyes moved, just slightly, to look at them both. And in that look, Ethan saw everything. Oliver's hope, Jessica's love, Lily's faith, Leo's innocence, and his own journey from grief to acceptance to something beyond both. He saw that they were all part of something larger, a tapestry of love and loss and art that stretched backward and forward through time. Each thread essential, each color necessary. The store grew quiet as the sun set completely, but the back room remained lit by its own gentle glow. Leo stirred in Ethan's arms, mumbling something that might have been Oscar, or might have been Mama, or might have been both. And in that moment, in that impossible, magical space, Ethan understood that there was no difference. Love was love, regardless of its source or its expression. Art was art, whether it was painted on canvas or lived in daily acts of courage and kindness. And magic was simply what happened when people chose to believe in something greater than themselves, chose to see the world not as it appeared to be, but as it could be, should be, would be if love had its way. The canvas of curiosity had become something more than just a chapter in their lives. It had become a doorway to understanding that the world was far stranger and more wonderful than most people ever realized. And as Ethan carried his sleeping son home through the darkening streets, the wooden bear warm in Leo's grip, he knew that this was just the beginning. There were more stories to be painted, more love to be shared, more magic to be discovered. And somewhere, in a space between real and unreal, Oscar waited, patient and eternal, ready to show the next broken heart that wholeness was not only possible but inevitable, as long as there were those brave enough to believe. By the way, if you're enjoying this story of love, art, and the magic that exists in between, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Your support helps us share more incredible stories like this one. Stories that remind us all that wonder still exists in the world if we just know where to look for it. The colors of connection. Winter had settled over the city like a soft blanket, transforming the familiar streets into something from a fairy tale. Snow fell in fat, lazy flakes that seemed to dance in the air before settling on the ground, and Ethan found himself returning to Morgan's colors almost daily now, drawn by something he couldn't quite name but didn't want to resist. Leo would clap his hands whenever they turned onto Maple Street, recognizing the route even at his young age, calling out, "Oscar, Oscar," in his clear, piping voice that made passers-by smile, even though they had no idea what he meant. It had been 3 months since their first encounter with the painted bear cub that lived between worlds, and in that time, Ethan had watched his son bloom in ways he hadn't expected. Leo was talking more, his vocabulary expanding rapidly as if Oscar was somehow teaching him words in their silent conversations. But more than that, there was a light in his son's eyes, a confidence and joy that hadn't been there in the months following Jessica's death. It was as if Oscar had given him permission to be happy again, to embrace magic without guilt, to love without fear of loss. This particular morning was different, though. When they pushed through the heavy wooden door, the bell chiming its familiar welcome, Lily was waiting for them with an expression Ethan had never seen before, a mixture of excitement and nervousness that made her look younger, more vulnerable. "I need to show you something," she said without preamble, taking Leo from Ethan's arms with the easy familiarity of someone who had become family. "Something happened last night, something I don't understand but think you need to see." She led them to the back room, but even before she opened the door, Ethan could feel it, a change in the air, an electricity that made the hair on his arms stand up. When the door swung open, he gasped. The room was filled with color, but not in any way that made logical sense. Colors floated in the air like aurora borealis brought indoors, ribbons of light that twisted and danced and merged and separated in patterns that hurt to follow with human eyes. And at the center of it all was Oscar, but Oscar as Ethan had never seen him before. The bear cub was glowing, not with the subtle warmth they'd grown accustomed to, but with an intense, pulsing light that seemed to come from within. His painted fur rippled with colors that shouldn't exist, shades between shades that had no names. And most remarkably, he was standing on his hind legs, his front paws raised, as if he were conducting an orchestra of light. Leo squirmed in Lily's arms, reaching for his friend, and she set him down carefully. The moment the boy's feet touched the floor, the colors in the air responded, swirling around him in a protective, playful spiral that made him giggle with delight. "It started at midnight," Lily explained, her voice hushed with awe. "I was upstairs in my apartment when I heard, I don't know how to describe it, music but not music, singing but without words. I came down and found him like this, and look." She pointed to the walls, and Ethan saw what she meant. The paintings that lined the room, Lily's work and others, were moving. Not dramatically, but subtly. Figures walking through landscapes, water flowing in seascapes, flowers blooming and closing in still lifes. It was as if every piece of art in the room had been infected with Oscar's strange life. Leo toddled toward Oscar with the fearlessness of childhood, and the bear cub lowered himself back to all fours, the light dimming to a more manageable level. But the colors in the air remained, and as Leo reached out to touch his friend, something extraordinary happened. Where the boy's hand met Oscar's fur, new colors bloomed, colors that were uniquely Leo's, Ethan realized. The soft pink of his son's laughter, the deep blue of his concentration when playing with blocks, the golden green of his eyes when he first woke up in the morning. These colors didn't just appear. They became part of Oscar, weaving themselves into his painted coat like new threads in a tapestry. "My God," Ethan breathed, sinking to his knees beside his son. He's painting himself with Leo's emotions." Lily nodded, tears streaming down her face. "But that's not all. Look closer." Ethan leaned in, and that's when he saw it. In Oscar's eyes, images flickered like old film reels, memories. But not Oscar's memories, they were Oliver's. A young boy running through a field, arms spread wide like airplane wings. The same boy in a hospital bed drawing bears on every surface he could reach. Lily, younger, teaching Oliver to mix paints. And then, shocking in its clarity, an image of Jessica that Ethan had never seen before. She was standing in what looked like this very room, though Ethan knew that was impossible. She had never been here, had died before they'd discovered Morgan's colors. But there she was, clear as day, painting something Ethan couldn't quite see, her face lit with the same ethereal glow that now surrounded Oscar. "How?" Ethan asked, his voice cracking. Lily shook her head, equally bewildered. "I don't know, but I think Oscar isn't just what I painted anymore. He's become something more, something that exists at the intersection of all our stories." Leo had both hands on Oscar now, and the bear cub was nuzzling him gently, making a sound that was definitely not a bear sound. It was more like a lullaby, wordless but familiar. And then Ethan recognized it. It was the song Jessica used to hum when she painted, a melody she'd made up that had no name, but that had become the soundtrack to their lives together. His eyes filled with tears as he realized what was happening. Oscar wasn't just alive in some magical, impossible way. He was a conduit, a bridge between the living and the dead, between memory and reality, between all the different kinds of love that made life worth living. "There's more," Lily said softly, and she moved to a corner of the room Ethan hadn't paid attention to before. There was an easel there, covered with a cloth. "This appeared this morning, right before you arrived. I didn't put it here. I've never seen it before." She pulled off the cloth, and Ethan's heart stopped. It was one of Jessica's paintings, but not one he recognized. It was unfinished, the bottom half still rough sketches, but the top was complete and stunning. It showed Oscar, but Oscar as he was now, glowing and impossible. And around him were figures. Oliver and Jessica, yes, but also others. Children Ethan didn't recognize. Adults with kind faces. All of them connected by threads of light that emanated from Oscar's heart. "She painted this?" Ethan asked, though he knew the answer. He knew Jessica's style like he knew his own heartbeat. But when? How? Lily touched the canvas gently, and where her fingers made contact, the paint shimmered. "I think she painted it the same way you painted Oscar's heart mark. Not with her hands, but with her spirit." Love finding a way to express itself even after the body is gone. It should have been terrifying, this evidence of something beyond death, but instead Ethan felt a profound peace settle over him. Jessica was still creating, still contributing to the beauty of the world, just in a different way than before. Leo had climbed onto Oscar's back now, and the bear cub was walking slowly around the room, giving the boy a ride. Everywhere they passed, the paintings on the walls responded, colors brightening, figures turning to watch them, landscapes shifting to accommodate their passage. It was like being inside a living story, one that was being written in real time by everyone who had ever loved and lost and chosen to keep loving anyway. "Why now?" Ethan asked. "Why is this happening now?" Lily was quiet for a moment, watching Leo and Oscar with a soft smile. "Today is Oliver's birthday," she said finally. "He would have been 17. I think this is his gift to us, or maybe our gift to him, or maybe there's no difference." As if in response to her words, the colors in the air began to coalesce, forming shapes that almost made sense before dissolving again. Ethan thought he saw faces in them, Oliver's certainly, but others too. All the children who had visited Oscar, all the parents who had found comfort here, all the connections that had been made in this impossible room. And at the center of it all, clearer than anything else, was Jessica's face, smiling the way she used to when she'd finished a painting she was particularly proud of. "Can you see her?" Ethan asked Lily, his voice barely a whisper. Lily nodded, fresh tears on her cheeks. "She's beautiful. She looks proud of you, proud of Leo, proud of what you've both become." The image of Jessica seemed to turn toward them, and though her lips didn't move, Ethan heard her voice as clearly as if she were standing beside him. Not words, exactly, but meaning transmitted directly to his heart. She was okay. More than okay, she was part of something larger now, something that included Oscar and Oliver and all the love that had ever been or ever would be. And she wanted him to know that their story wasn't over, had never been over, would never be over as long as love continued to find new ways to express itself. Leo slid off Oscar's back and ran to his father, arms outstretched. "Mama here," he said with the simple certainty of childhood. "Mama painting." And Ethan realized his son was right. Jessica was here, in the colors that danced through the air, in the impossible life of a painted bear, in the way the room itself seemed to pulse with creative energy. She was painting still, just with a different kind of brush, on a different kind of canvas. The separation between life and death, between real and imaginary, between possible and impossible. These were just human constructs, limitations that love didn't recognize or respect. Lily moved to stand beside them, her hand finding Ethan's and squeezing gently. "Oliver used to say that death was just a change of medium," she said softly, that artists never really die, they just find new ways to create. I thought it was just a child's fantasy, a way of coping with his illness. But he was right, wasn't he? They're all still creating, still contributing, still part of the great work of making the world more beautiful than it was before. The colors in the air were settling now, sinking into the walls, the floor, the ceiling, leaving everything subtly changed. The room seemed larger, though its dimensions hadn't changed. The paintings seemed more alive, though they had returned to their stillness. And Oscar looked at them with eyes that held universes, the promised adventures and comfort and connection beyond anything they could imagine. He was no longer just Lily's creation or Oliver's dream, or even the combination of all their love. He was something new, something that had never existed before and might never exist again. A living testament to the power of love to transcend every boundary, overcome every obstacle, and create beauty from even the deepest pain. "What do we do now?" Ethan asked, feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they'd witnessed. Lily smiled, and in that smile was all the wisdom of someone who had learned to live with mystery, to embrace the impossible, to find joy in the inexplicable. "We keep coming back, we keep bringing Leo, we keep sharing Oscar with those who need him, and we keep adding our colors to the canvas, whatever form that takes." She paused, looking at Jessica's mysterious painting. "And maybe we start painting together, all of us, creating something that none of us could create alone." Over the following weeks, that's exactly what they did. Lily cleared a space in the back room and set up multiple easels. She provided paints and brushes, but also encouraged people to bring their own materials: crayons from children, pencils from sketch artists, even unusual things like coffee grounds and flower petals that someone insisted on using to create texture. The rule was simple. Everyone who visited Oscar could add something to what became known as the Eternal Canvas, a massive piece that covered one entire wall and seemed to grow larger every day without anyone quite understanding how. Leo would paint with his fingers, creating abstract swirls that somehow perfectly captured the essence of childhood joy. Ethan found himself painting memories, not representational images, but emotional impressions of moments with Jessica, with Leo, with his own parents who had passed years ago. Lily added technical skill, helping to blend the various contributions into something cohesive while still maintaining each person's unique voice. And Oscar would watch it all, sometimes still, sometimes moving in his subtle way, always present, always accepting, always somehow guiding the work without directly interfering. The blind girl who had heard Oscar singing returned with her grandmother, and she painted too, using her hands to feel the textures, creating something that wasn't visual but was somehow still visible, if that made any sense. A teenage boy who had lost his younger sister to leukemia spent hours adding tiny details that only became apparent when you stood very close. Hidden faces, secret messages, small symbols of hope scattered throughout the larger work. A mother who had lost 3 pregnancies painted 3 translucent birds that seemed to fly between the other images. Present but not quite there, remembered but not confined. And through it all, Jessica's presence grew stronger. Not in any ghostly or frightening way, but as a warm certainty, a creative force that helped guide hands that didn't know what to paint, that suggested colors to those overwhelmed by choice, that whispered encouragement to those who thought they had no artistic ability. Ethan would sometimes catch glimpses of her in his peripheral vision, a flutter of her favorite sundress, the sweep of her hair, the gesture of her hand holding a brush. But when he turned to look directly, there was only the warm air and the sense of being loved beyond the boundaries of death. One day, A man came to the store who looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. His clothes were rumpled, his eyes hollow, his hands shaking slightly as he stood in the doorway of the back room, staring at Oscar. "My daughter," he said, his voice broken. "She was 6, cancer, 3 weeks ago. Someone at the hospital told me about this place, but I don't know what I'm supposed to do here." Leo, who was playing near Oscar, looked up at the man with those wise eyes that seemed far too knowing for his age. Then he stood, walked over to the stranger, and took his hand, leading him to Oscar without a word. The man sank to his knees in front of the painted bear, and something in him seemed to break. He sobbed, great gasping sobs that shook his entire body, while Oscar remained perfectly still except for his eyes, which never left the man's face. Leo patted the man's back with his small hand, making soothing sounds that weren't quite words. And then, without anyone suggesting it, the man reached for a brush. He didn't ask permission, didn't hesitate, just began painting on the eternal canvas. What emerged was raw and painful and beautiful. A child's face constructed entirely of light, laughing even as she dissolved into stars. When he finished, hours later, the man looked different. Not healed, not fixed, but somehow more whole despite his brokenness. "She loved bears," he said quietly, looking at Oscar. "Had dozens of stuffed ones. Called them her bear army. Said they protected her from bad dreams." Oscar moved then, just his head, tilting it in what could only be described as acknowledgement. And in that moment the man smiled. A small, fragile smile, but real. "She would have loved you," he told Oscar. "She would have said you were the king of all bears, the one the others reported to." That became Oscar's new title among the children who visited. The Bear King, the one who held court in the back room of Morgan's Colors, who listened to their stories and their fears and their hopes without judgment, who existed in the space between real and imaginary where all things were possible. And the eternal canvas grew, becoming not just a painting but a living document of love and loss and resilience, a testament to the human ability to create beauty from pain, to find connection in isolation, to keep loving even when the object of that love was no longer physically present. Ethan began to document it all, taking photographs that never quite captured what the room really looked like, but tried anyway. He started a journal, writing down the stories of the people who came to visit Oscar, the things they painted, the ways they changed. He didn't know why he was doing it at first, but gradually he understood. This was his contribution, his art, the preservation of these moments, these connections, these small miracles that happened every day in a back room that shouldn't exist, with a bear that couldn't be real, in a store that was more than a store. Winter turned to spring, and with it came a new development. Oscar began to venture out of the back room. Not far and not often, but sometimes Ethan would arrive to find the bear cub in the main store, sitting perfectly still among the regular merchandise, looking like an extraordinarily well-crafted sculpture. Only those who had been to the back room could see him move, could see the life in his painted eyes. To everyone else, he was just art, remarkable but explainable. It was, Lily said, Oscar's way of choosing who was ready to see him, who needed him, who could handle the truth of his existence. One afternoon, as Ethan was helping Lily reorganize some supplies, Leo playing contentedly near Oscar in the back room, a woman entered the store who made them both freeze. She looked exactly like Jessica, not similar, not reminiscent, but exactly like her. The same hair, the same eyes, the same way of tilting her head when she was thinking. But she was older, perhaps by 10 years, and there was something different about her energy, her presence. "I'm looking for something," she said, her voice different from Jessica's, deeper, more weathered. I don't know what exactly, I just felt pulled here. Lily and Ethan exchanged glances, and without discussion, Lily led the woman to the back room. The moment she entered, Oscar stood up on his hind legs, something he had never done for a stranger before. The woman gasped, her hand flying to her heart, but she didn't run, didn't scream, didn't even seem particularly surprised. "Oh," she said softly, as if recognizing something she'd been looking for all her life. "There you are." She approached Oscar slowly, reverently, and when she reached him, she did something unexpected. She began to sing. It was the melody Jessica used to hum, the one Oscar had reproduced, but with words now, words in a language Ethan didn't recognize but somehow understood. It was a song about love that transcends form, about connections that death cannot sever, about the eternal dance of souls finding and losing and finding each other again. Oscar swayed slightly, as if dancing to the music, and the colors that had hidden in the walls since winter began to emerge again, painting the air with ribbons of light. "My sister," the woman said when the song ended, turning to look at Ethan with eyes that were Jessica's but weren't. "My twin sister. She died when we were 3. I don't remember her, not really, but I've been singing that song all my life and I never knew why or where it came from." She looked back at Oscar, at the heart mark Ethan had painted, and gasped again. "That's her. Somehow, that's her. I can feel it." The revelation should have been shattering. The idea that Jessica might have been a twin, that there was this whole piece of her history Ethan had never known. But instead it felt like another piece of a vast puzzle clicking into place. Of course, Jessica had a twin. Of course, that twin would find her way here. Of course, Oscar would recognize her, would respond to her presence. In this place where love rewrote the rules of reality, where art could live and breathe, where the dead could still paint, of course there would be connections that spanned not just death but life itself, threads that connected souls across time and space and circumstance. Leo toddled over to the woman, whose name, they learned, was Jennifer, and looked up at her with those knowing eyes. "Aunt Jenny," he said clearly, though no one had told him her name. She knelt down and gathered him into her arms, and both of them started crying. But it was the good kind of crying, the kind that cleanses and heals and makes space for new growth. "I've been looking for you without knowing it," she whispered to Leo. "You and your daddy both. Jessica sent me, I think, in dreams, in feelings, in this pull I couldn't explain." Jennifer became part of their strange family after that, another color in the ever-expanding palette of their lives. She was an artist, too, it turned out, a sculptor who worked with found objects, creating beautiful things from what others had discarded. She began adding three-dimensional elements to the eternal canvas, pieces that jutted out from the wall, creating shadows and depth that changed depending on where you stood. Oscar accepted her immediately, allowing her to paint details on his fur that only appeared in certain lights, secret messages from Jessica that only those who knew where to look could see. The store began to attract attention from beyond the neighborhood. Not media attention. Somehow that never materialized, as if the place was protected by the same magic that animated Oscar. But word spread in other ways, through whispers and recommendations, through dreams and coincidences, through the kind of knowing that bypasses the rational mind. People came from other cities, other states, sometimes even other countries, drawn by something they couldn't name but couldn't resist. And Oscar welcomed them all, was what each of them needed him to be, helped them paint their pain and joy onto the canvas that had long ago exceeded the boundaries of the wall and had begun spreading across the ceiling, the floor, even onto Oscar himself, who wore the accumulated stories like a coat of many colors. One evening, as summer approached and the light in the back room took on a golden quality that had nothing to do with the sun, Ethan found himself alone with Oscar for the first time in months. Leo was with Jennifer, who had become the aunt he'd never known he needed. Lily was upstairs, resting after a particularly emotional day when 7 different families had come to add to the canvas, and Ethan sat with the painted bear who had changed all their lives, feeling the weight of everything that had happened, everything that continued to happen. "Thank you," he said to Oscar, not feeling silly at all for talking to what others might see as just paint and canvas. "Thank you for showing me that Jessica isn't gone, just changed. Thank you for giving Leo this magic. Thank you for being whatever it is you are." Oscar looked at him with those impossible eyes, and Ethan could swear he saw Jessica in them, along with Oliver and all the others who had found peace here. The bear cub moved closer, resting his painted head against Ethan's leg, and the warmth that spread from that contact was more real than anything Ethan had ever felt. In that moment, Ethan understood something fundamental. The colors of connection weren't just the paints on the canvas or the hues that danced through the air when Oscar was particularly active. They were the invisible threads that connected every person who had ever loved, ever lost, ever chosen to keep creating despite the pain. They were the recognition that we are all part of the same vast artwork, each of us adding our unique colors to a masterpiece that will never be finished because it grows with every new love, every new loss, every new choice to keep believing in beauty. The room grew quiet as the sun set, but it was a full quiet, a quiet that held all the stories, all the connections, all the love that had been shared within these walls. And somewhere, in a place that wasn't exactly here, but wasn't exactly elsewhere, Jessica continued to paint, Oliver continued to dream, and all the others who had passed through the veil continued to contribute to the great work. Oscar was their ambassador, their bridge, their promise that nothing is ever truly lost, only transformed. As Ethan finally stood to leave, he noticed something new on the canvas. In a corner that had been empty that morning, there was a small painting within the painting. A window or a door, he couldn't tell which, that seemed to open onto another space entirely. Through it, he could see figures moving, painting, creating, all of them familiar but transformed, all of them working on what looked like another version of the eternal canvas, one that existed in whatever realm they now inhabited. And at the center of that other canvas was another Oscar, or maybe the same Oscar viewed from a different angle, connecting not just the living, but the living and the dead in an endless cycle of creation and love. The revelation took his breath away. They weren't just painting a memorial or a tribute, they were painting a portal, a connection point between worlds, a place where the boundary between life and death became permeable, where love could flow freely in both directions. Every person who added to the canvas was strengthening that connection, making it more real, more stable, more accessible. Oscar wasn't just a magical bear brought to life by grief and love. He was a guardian of the threshold, a guide between worlds, a living symbol of the truth that love is the only force in the universe that transcends every boundary. Ethan left the store that night with a new understanding of his purpose. He wasn't just a grieving widower anymore, wasn't just Leo's father, wasn't just someone who had stumbled into magic. He was a keeper of stories, a facilitator of connections, a painter of bridges between worlds. And tomorrow, he would return with Leo and Jennifer and Lily, and they would continue the work. They would add new colors to the canvas, welcome new visitors to Oscar's court, and strengthen the bonds that connected all of them, living and dead, real and imaginary, possible and impossible. because in the end, that's what love does. It refuses to accept limitations. It finds ways to express itself despite every obstacle. It creates beauty from pain, connection from isolation, hope from despair. And in a small art supply store on Maple Street, in a back room that existed between worlds, a painted bear cub named Oscar stood as proof that love was the most powerful force in any universe. The ultimate artist whose masterpiece was the connection between all hearts that had ever beaten or ever would. The colors of connection weren't just about art or magic or even about transcending death. They were about the fundamental truth that we are all part of the same story, all adding our verses to the same eternal song, all painting with the same infinite palette of love. And as long as there were those brave enough to pick up a brush, to add their colors to the canvas, to believe in Oscar and all he represented, the connections would continue to grow stronger, the boundaries would continue to dissolve, and the great work of love would continue, forever and always, world without end.